I want to do a little follow-up here on our discussion of population and really historical controls of population, first of all. I think one of the things that's interesting in talking about population, especially in a class, is a lot of times students will say something like, well, won't population growth take care of itself? Won't there be like a major epidemic or something that'll kill everybody? And I'm always kind of stunned by that comment, because is that how we want to solve, a quote-unquote population growth problem? Is that what we want to do, is just, be, nothing more than a snowshoe hare, basically eat ourselves out of our population, let 30% of the individuals die, or 70 or 80% of the individuals die, and then start over again? I don't think people really think about the consequences of that. I mean, that would be the end of society, humanity as we know it. And again, maybe you're the one that dies. Maybe your wife, your child, or your mother, your father are the ones that die. You don't get to pick that. So hopefully, and again, when we look at this from an ecologist perspective, we try to have a little more reasoned approach about where we're headed with our population. What are we going to do about that? Hopefully address economic issues and so on. Having said that, though, when we look at human population and populations in general, I would say, but certainly human population, one of the major controlling factors in human population has been disease. And so I want to talk a little bit about disease. And first of all, when we look at disease, there are kind of two major classes of disease. Infectious disease, which has some agent of transmission, something which causes the disease that can be transmitted from person to person. And we've talked about some of these things, such as bacteria, viruses, helminthic worms, all kinds of things. So this would be an infectious disease. And non-infectious disease would be where there is no agent of transmission. It could be a genetic disease, for example, a tendency towards a particular type of cancer, or some environmental cause of a particular kind of disease. So that would be a non-infectious disease. So as we look at infectious disease then, in terms of transmission, one mode of transmission is direct transmission. And so that's where one individual can, quote unquote, directly pass this to another person, perhaps through aerosol droplets, perhaps through body fluids. There are also vector-transmitted diseases where, again, and we've talked a little bit about these before, where there's an insect that will actually transmit and carry the disease from one individual to another. So it would be a vector-transmitted disease. And then also when we look at disease, we classify disease in terms of the incidence, the rate of incidence of the disease. So an endemic disease is one that is occurring in low numbers in a population. An epidemic is a localized outbreak or increase in the incidence of a particular disease. And a pandemic then would be a global epidemic. And again, especially with humans, whereas in the past we were isolated on different continents, or perhaps there were geographic separations, rivers, mountains, and things like that kept populations isolated, that's no longer the case. And so an epidemic can begin on one continent and through air travel, be on another continent in the same day. Also, disease is categorized as being acute or chronic. An acute disease is one that is generally of shorter duration but very intense, whereas chronic diseases tend to be of longer duration and less intense in severity. And again, as we look at disease, and human disease in particular, one of the real concerns is about epidemic avian flu. Avian flu is a concern because we don't have a natural immunity to avian flu. And again, it has the potential to mutate into something that could begin to infect humans, and then we would not have any kind of natural immunity to that. And so that is potentially a devastating problem. And a lot of these new diseases come out of Asia, and part of the problem there is that we have different kinds of animals in close proximity. Typically, animals are raised, slaughtered, and sold all in the same location. And so again, when you compare that to, say, United States, we raise our animals in one place, we slaughter them in another, we sell them in another. And we tend to separate them by species so that we don't have a mixture of blood types and potential pathogens mixing together. So generally speaking, sometimes students will ask, well, why does this stuff always seem to come out of Asia? Why is there a new flu coming out of Asia every year? And that's part of the reason, is that it's just kind of a melting pot of different species and different pathogens all mixing together in a rather unusual way. So anyway, but it is, this kind of comes and goes in terms of concern of the public, but this is one of the really big concerns out there. It has been for a while, then it kind of disappears from the public's mind, but it's always on the mind of the health officials and certainly those of us interested in ecology. Now, in controlling non-human populations, again, there are a lot of ways to do that if you decide that a population is getting too big. One would be hunting or harvesting. It's fairly specific in terms of who it addresses, but I would say one of the downsides of hunting, among many, is that it's not a natural replacement for predators, and we'll talk more about that later, because hunters tend to go after the biggest and the best in prime of reproductive life, whereas predators tend to go after animals opportunistically, just going after the first thing they catch, or can catch, or going after the weak, diseased, the old, the very young. Trapping can be used. The problem with trapping is that sometimes you aren't getting your target species. The same is true of poisoning. Poisoning can be a real problem because, again, you'll kill animals that you don't intend to kill. Also, poisons can get in the environment, and instead of being localized in their effect, can be rather unlocalized. And then sometimes we've tried introducing pathogens into an area to get rid of certain predators, and that usually doesn't work that well either. Initially, you'll have success, and then sometimes it spreads beyond the intended species, or the species will develop an immunity to your pathogen. So again, the best way would be to maintain natural predators when at all possible for certain prey types, but again, these are some techniques that can be used to control non-human populations. And then last but not least, certainly birth control is an aspect of family planning and is sometimes controversial, but and I don't want to turn this into a health class, but just very quickly, there's of course abstinence, the rhythm method, which looks at the menstrual cycle and targets trying to avoid intercourse around times of ovulation. There are a variety of barrier methods, condom, diaphragm, and so on. Hormonal methods, the birth control pill, spermicides typically used in combination with barrier methods. Sterilization, so tubal ligation in a female, and vasectomy in a male. And surprisingly, in some countries, that's a very, very common way of controlling births. And then certainly abortion, it would be one on the list as well. So again, as we look at human population, certainly abortion is very controversial in this country, but again, I have to wonder sometimes as if we don't change our behavior. If we're going to double in 40 or 50 or 60 or 70 years, how do we react to that? I think it would be a tragedy if we ever, looked at birth of a human being as being anything other than the greatest thing in the world. But you have to wonder what our view will be in 50, 60, 70, 80, 100 years. So anyway, again, just some other things I wanted to talk about related to population control. And that'll do it for today.